One in Three is intended for mature audiences. Episodes contain explicit content and may be triggering as they often include violence and other varying forms of abuse such as emotional, psychological, sexual, and physical. In most cases, names have been changed to protect all involved. Please note, statements and opinions of guests do not necessarily reflect those of my own. Hi, warriors. Welcome to One in Three. I'm your host, Ingrid. Surviving and escaping an abusive relationship is a feat in and of itself. When children are involved and there is a shared custody situation, you may find yourself stuck in your abuser's cycle of control. This leads you to a high conflict co-parenting situation. Marisol Vasquez, a high conflict co-parenting coach, joins me today to explain what exactly that means. Here is Marisol. Hey, Marisol, thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm happy to be here.
You have a strong social media presence on co-parenting and high conflict co-parenting specifically. So before we get into all the details of that, do you mind just giving a background on how you got started into that?
So I got started because of my own personal experience. I have two kids with two different dads. And at some point, I managed two child custody cases and two child support cases. My longest custody battle was actually for my daughter. It lasted almost a decade. So a lot of my experience comes from my own, ways of having to survive, live, and still have dreams somehow.
So a decade. So that means that these were happening at some point at the same time.
Yes, I actually had to manage. One of the worst months I ever had was in 2011, back in November, I think it was. I actually had 4 court hearings in 1 month. Two, I believe, were for one ex, one was for the other, and then the last one was for bankruptcy.
Oh my
So,
goodness.
my court cases were actually in 3 different courts. So I actually attended 3 different courthouses that I had to learn how to navigate during that time of my life.
Okay, just going into a courthouse on its own
Right,
for something simple is intimidating enough, but
right.
that's
Well,
crazy.
I actually have a very weird story where, like, I was trying to get some evidence, right? Because I was being accused of something. I forgot which accusation I was being accused of at this point because my daughter's father accused me of a lot of things. So I was trying to portray how much we were constantly in court and how he was, being overly litigious. And I went to the courthouse that our court case was at. And I went into the records department looking for my court case because I wanted to see what they had, not necessarily what I had, but what they had on file. Right? I was looking for something, and then the court clerk tells me your file's not here. It's actually across the street in the basement because it's so large.
Oh
Well,
my
at
gosh.
that time, I had a baby. My son was a baby, and I had a stroller with me. So I crossed the street and I went to the archives, right? To go get the custody case. And when I went down there, I actually had to go to the basement. There was hardly any security down there. There was no cameras. It was so dingy looking. It was dark. I wasn't even sure what was down there, but eventually I found the office with the staff in it and they handed me and I was able to check out my large court case. It was
That's
it was
insane.
very, very insane. Yeah. It was like a whole surreal experience that I still wonder how we survived it. However, I do have a lot of insight and tips on how to safeguard your relationship with your kids because while you're going through this, your kid's childhood is actually still moving forward. So that's what I focused on, even though it was very difficult for me and it was especially difficult for my daughter.
I imagine so. And that's mainly the reason why there is some high conflict co-parenting issues is because it's almost like one parent has the children's best interest in mind and the other one does not.
Yeah, I learned the hard way that if you're gonna be dealing with a high conflict co-parent, you're unfortunately gonna have different agendas. You're typically not going to have the same version of what healthy parenting looks like, even semi-healthy, because not, I don't think parenting is perfect at all. I think we're all evolving as parents. Like, it's okay for you to figure out that maybe what you were doing a year ago, what wasn't working because maybe now your kid's telling you, hey, Mom, I don't like that, and you can change it. You know what I mean? So we're always evolving as parents. So in terms of high conflict co-parenting, that parent, the one that's truly high conflict, they're really not going to have the same agenda as you. And also that agenda and that mindset will hit the courtroom. And that's why it becomes so high conflict, because they have a different mentality on what they want. Usually what they want is control and to win. And from my experience, all the years that I've been through with all the court hearings that I've gone through as well for both of my children, I'm going to tell you that there's no winning in court hearings for custody or even child support. It takes a lot. It takes a lot from you as a person, and it also takes a lot from the kids too. So even if you do walk away with something, there's something at some point that you lost to even get that.
Oh, totally. And I mean, when you come from a domestic violence relationship and then you have to co parent afterward, like you mentioned, it's that control. They
Mhm.
still use whatever tactics, even in certain cases, using the children as pawns or manipulating the children to maintain that control over you.
Yes.
And then eventually also over the children. They kind of turn into their victims as well.
Yes, that's a different component of that. Is so much to unpack there. But yes, so my daughter's father actually ended up leaving me for her stepmom. And what was interesting about our situation is that right off the bat, they both got this really weird drive to really hate me, as if I had done something wrong to them, even though he actually was the one who walked away with her. With time, I learned to be comfortable with some of the dynamic of it, just because my daughter grew to really love her. um, but in essence, it all of that actually ended up hitting the courtroom too. The drama that surrounded that never let up. And to the point that it started affecting different aspects of our lives. So having been part of that custody case, their behavior was so detrimental that it actually, was at her school. It was in her homework. It was doctor's appointments. You know what I mean? Like in their brain, I can never do anything right. To the point that we couldn't even share a doctor. They insisted on like going to a separate doctor because they had embedded that doctor, so they had to move my kid to another doctor. Same thing for dentists. Dentists were a problem too. Then emergency contacts, that was a problem too. So it was like constant battles for even the smallest things that you can ever think of. It essentially is a systematic infiltration of your life.
Right. And one that you can't escape because
Right.
your
And
child's tied to you.
yeah, and you can't. And when you tell that to the courts, it sounds like you're the one that's being naggy and complaining because, you sound like you're the crazy one. And essentially, as my daughter got older, I realized that they were weaponizing my daughter against me. They weaponize my child. Yeah. And
Of course. Yeah.
that's a harsh reality to realize, because it's like, how can a parent want to do that? You know what I mean? Like you're over here trying to raise your child, and you're like, okay, well, you left me, fine. You're not here anymore. I have accepted that. Now you're with this person and you're making this new life. Fine then. Why are you still after me?
Right.
Parenting is
Just let me go.
right. Parenting is already hard enough, than to add the dynamic of high conflict co-parenting, right? And even that sentence, high conflict co-parenting, even that within itself is a bit of an oxymoron, because you actually cannot fully parent with a high conflict co-parent. You're constantly countering. You're constantly countering, and I called it DC. I was constantly on damage control.
Right. It's almost like you can't progress with your children because you're having to undo all the
Yeah,
the bad things.
right.
So so you have your personal experience with this, but then you also have a professional background that helps you understand these situations.
Well, I mean, I have a master's degree in criminal justice. I'm not really sure. There probably is some tied, transferable skills to it. I'm not gonna, sit here and say that I'm like a mental health counselor, because I'm not. I'm not a mental health professional. I'm also not an attorney or a legal professional. I do have that master's. When I got that back when I was younger, it is transferable in terms of like the way that I think and how to defend myself when I was in court. My ex couldn't pay child support, but he did hire attorneys. So, you know, I did end up hiring two at some point, and there's only so much that you can do as a single mom because you're being targeted in so many ways, emotionally, legally, financially. You know, I mean, some at some point it was targeting my spiritual side too, where I'm like, how is this happening to me? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not a bad person. Why are they coming at me so hard? You know, so yeah, I do have some background, but I wouldn't, I don't want to be overstating what I do have. I also do have. I'm also certified in natural health as a natural health professional from the Trinity School of Natural Health, and I only got that certification because with a lot of high conflict comes um, health conditions, health issues. Because you're constantly on high cortisol levels, so you're stressed out, and that ended up affecting my body. So I do have an autoimmune condition that I take care of on my own. Sometimes I do bring in an outside party to help me if I get stuck, but most of the time I have learned enough now about natural healing modalities to be able to basically take care of myself. To mentally and even physically. I don't believe in meds. If people do, that's their prerogative, but I basically manage my conditions naturally.
There's so many things
Right.
that obviously go into this.
Right.
I mean, there are like 10 different avenues that we could take this
I'm like,
episode.
that was a lot,
Um,
right? Yeah. So
yeah, but
my
it's true.
journey has been like very unique, and also very eclectic in the way where like where I'm at now, it's nowhere where I thought I would be. You know, some pros, some cons. um, the court hearings that eventually did end, but the aftermath of it, it's still there. It's still there. Yeah, it
And
doesn't
I'm
just die off.
no, and I even think that once your children are beyond school age and you think, okay, we're done, and there's not that necessary co-parenting that needs to happen because they're technically adults now, but you still have there's graduations,
Right,
there's grandbabies,
right,
there's
right.
weddings, and all sorts of different things that you're still going to have to interact with that
Well,
other person.
You yeah, there is, but it just depends on the comfortability of your child and what they wanna do and how they one of the hardest things that I had to learn is that regardless of what my exes have done, my kids' dads, my child has the right to select how they want to proceed with their relationship with their father. Um, irrelevant to my own experience, irrelevant to what they've put me through, what they've left me hanging on, what they've neglected, because the child has their own experience because that is their father. And I'm not saying that they have to talk to him. Some people will do the whole like forceful thing, oh, you must talk to him because he's your dad. That's not the approach I take. I take more of the approach of, well, go explore it, go figure it out. And if you want to go no contact or if you want to limit your contact, those do exist if you need to do that. That's kind of I'm more of a background actor now for my kids. I'm not really front and center when it comes to that because now they can actually speak for themselves. They have their own values, they have their own perspectives. So I try my best, even though it's hard, because mama got opinions too. So I try my best to just be supportive, even if I don't agree with it. It is my child's
Which
journey, and it is a difficult journey, and, if they need support, I am there, I am there to just provide that, because it is a hard thing to stomach that your other parent, is what they are.
And that's a testament to how much that you have healed and matured through the process, because I imagine it would be difficult to co-parent with somebody that you loathe, and not to impart your own personal bias onto your kids. Like,
Yes.
hey, that parent's the bad
Right,
guy.
right. And you're right. There is a level of like dislike that I do still have sometimes, but it's not to the point that I used to have when I was still in it. So, whoever's listening to this, my current journey might be different in how I feel now because see, I'm already a little bit away from it. So, if you're still in it, you're probably going to still feel those normal feelings of hate. I sound like I'm at peace at it because I'm already on my way out.
Right,
So,
right. Well, and almost betrayal too. Like if you get your kids and they're like, "Oh, I want to go back over to mommy or daddy's house. I miss mommy or daddy." The other parent you're almost thinking like, but what about me? Like, why aren't
Oh,
I?
girl, yes. So we actually had that situation happen on for Christmas, and Christmas for us was very different. We actually have traditions with that I created with my children. Every December we do family pictures. That's not necessarily what happened this December. We're still trying to figure out how to do the holiday, especially because now I live out of state. And my daughter lives in a different state, and then my son's with me, and then his dad lives somewhere else too. He doesn't live in the same state. So we're all in three different states. So Christmas looks very different. I truly do not mind sharing. That's one thing that I noticed that as I grew in my mentality, and I haven't always been this way, okay? It took a lot of growth, okay? So as I grew, I realized that yes, I'm sad. And I actually did cry when my son decided to go with his dad. I cried a lot because it's really hard to let go of your kids because, as single moms, they literally become our world. But then there's a certain level of like letting go that that has to happen because that's a natural way of things where they should be able to, have autonomy and individuate from us, to be separate from us. But that's still hard, because we're attached to them. So my son ended up going with his dad for 2 weeks for Christmas, and that was nowhere near me. It was like hundreds of miles away from me, you know, and I talk in one of my videos that I made on my Instagram account that we, as moms, protective, supportive moms, we end up doing things that are more like truly more in the best interest of our child than even the courts sometimes. Because we know more. Even if it hurts you, you will end up doing things for your kid that you see that maybe your kid needs, even if it breaks your heart.
Yeah, and that's oh my gosh. The emotional part is hard to let your kids go,
Yeah.
like, graduate high
Right.
school and
Hmm.
they're going off to start
Yeah.
their own life and everything's healthy and everybody gets along, that's hard enough, but then when they go to somebody else that
Hmm.
you don't get along with and,
Or that doesn't like
you know,
you.
that doesn't like you,
Right.
and we're gonna use a
Right.
strong word, hates you,
Right.
might hate
Well, you
you, and
mentioned you mentioned loath, and I actually stopped. I would say I stopped hating them a while back, but it took a lot of work, like I mentioned earlier. And I still do, kind of have my moments where I don't like them very much, but at the same time, I keep in my mind something that I kind of try to stay with, which is to love my kids more than I hate my ex. I don't know if you've ever heard that. And I actually made a little bit of a segment on it last year. Love your kids more than you hate your ex. And actually that even applies even to men if they're going through like a toxic, a relationship with their mothers, with their kids' moms, because it's not necessarily exclusive to gender, the level of toxicity that one can be put through, so I focus on that, and then now that my kids got older, they're actually able to voice to me like their needs and what they would like and their desires. And I'm just sitting here trying to figure out like, okay, how can I make this decision that best fits my child's needs? You know what I mean? Like outside of whatever court stuff's happening, but mind you, I am speaking from a different perspective because now we don't really have an operational court order for my son, and my son chooses when to go with his dad, and also the court order for my daughter did end too. And I kind of wanted just to be transparent about that because my perspective is different because of the fact that I'm at the tail end, and also you do operate differently when you're still in it. You do.
oh, for sure, especially when you're fresh out of the
Hmm.
relationship. So, obviously this is a podcast based on domestic violence. So you're coming out of a domestic violence situation. And, whatever the details of that is, you are freshly out of it. You're hurting, you're
Oh,
grieving.
100%. And you're pissed
And
too.
then now,
You're
and you're
pissed. You're
pissed.
pissed. And on top of that, they don't want to pay you.
Oh my goodness. Oh my gosh.
Right?
This is really, we're going to go in 10,000 different directions here. But so just a quick before we get too far into other things, can you give a definition of high conflict co-parenting, just so that everybody's on the same understanding level of what we're talking about before we go before we go down these 20 paths that
Right.
we've already
We
created?
might probably need like more segments. So high conflict co-parenting, the best way that I can describe it would be when there's two parents who have not been separated, they're or divorced, and they're having a difficult time agreeing on things. And usually it's stemming from the lack of maturity from one of them. Or and then they start using manipulative tactics. They can start using lies. They can start using intimidation. They can also start omitting information that you would need to have at some point that you need as the other parent. There's just a list of, there's also gaslighting too. So it just really depends. I don't typically use the word narcissist because it gets thrown around a lot. I know what I've experienced, and I do know that at least one of them is a narcissist. I don't have official diagnosis, but what I went through was definitely one was harder than the other, but they both were hard in their own way. So the best way to describe the high conflict co-parenting is basically two people that are trying to uh, make the best out of co-parenting, and one of them is making it extremely difficult. And if anything, they're highly litigious. That's even one component too, because that's actually different components. Because whenever they're doing one thing, they're actually doing separate things too. So it's basically like a multi-pronged system of how they're gonna just basically try to decimate you and try to not really co-parent. If anything, they're just trying to destroy your relationship with your child. Now there's different levels of it, you know what I mean? Like some of them are nicer than others, but it just at its core, they're just making co-parenting a lot more difficult than it should be, and just making decisions hard, like you can never decide on anything. Or even or if you propose something, your ideas are just never good enough, or if you're parenting, something's wrong with your parenting at every step of the way. I was constantly bashed for my parenting throughout the entire 10 years, and a lot of it, he kind of weaponized my background. I have a background in not having a good family dynamic. I have a toxic family dynamic with my biological family. So I didn't really have a mom, and I also I didn't have a dad. So he weaponized that in court and made it seem like I was not going to be a capable mom because I didn't know what a family was, according to him and his wife.
So they just continue to use the abusive tactics that they've
Mhm.
been using the whole
Yeah.
time.
And sometimes it's systematic. You won't even know if it's even happening until you're realizing like this doesn't sound right. And then now there's more information out there of it. There's a vast amount of information. I'm so super surprised how much there is. Back when I was in it, I don't remember being this much like, awareness of it. Because even at some point I felt like I was the crazy one because they told me I was the crazy one. And then you're going to court and court's telling you, no, that's not happening. You need to co-parent better. You know what I mean? Like you chose him. So why aren't you co-parenting with him?
Oh, I love that one. You chose him.
Yes. Yeah. Or like, because I have two kids with two different dads, right? I got the whole, well, how come you can't keep a man?
Oh,
you
that's
know,
nice.
well, what
Let's kick you while you're down.
Right? But I was younger. I was so much younger, and I some of those messages I did internalize. And as I got older and I also, grew and I did a lot of personal development, I realized how a lot of that, it did stem from some of the patterns that I needed to heal in my own personal life. But a lot of that is a lot of shifting ideology that's not making the other person accountable. So, people are going to have really judgy comments, especially when you have two kids from two different dads that do not look the same.
Right. And then like you mentioned, one of your exes remarried. So now you're not even having to deal with just him. You
Yeah.
have a couple commenting on
Mm.
your mothering skills. And
Yes.
then the court looks at it also as like there's a stable relationship
Right.
over there. And then there's just you.
Right. Right. So yes, that's definitely one of the experiences that I've had too, where like, he even went for the whole like, well, we have a traditional family environment, and she's a single mom. And, I think at one point he even like, I had never been called a feminist, and he called me a feminist. I even had to Google it because I'm like, what does that mean? And I forgot what Google told me, and I'm just like, maybe I am that. I don't know. But he would call me all kinds of names. There was a lot of name calling, that still stayed with me. That stayed with me. And it actually, not only did it stay with me, it actually kept me from doing what I'm doing now for a very long time because he was very, very, very verbally abusive.
Well, and it doesn't just have an impact on you, it has an impact on the kids
Yes.
too, because
Well, luckily we only had one child together. And it did make an impact on my daughter, in terms of she spent most of her life hearing really bad, just hearing me being bashed. Yeah. So I
which
go ahead. I'm sorry.
yeah, you look at so a kid has two like role models.
Hmm.
They have multiple role models, but the two people that they put on pedestals are mom and dad.
Yeah.
Or whatever the family dynamic is, their parents or two parents. And when you have one parent who they idolize is
Hmm.
speaking poorly about the other parent whom they also idolize, they then become confused,
Hmm.
like
Yes.
which one's the bad guy? Is one of them the bad guy, and is there something wrong with me for thinking
Right.
they're good and they're good?
It is a very confusing dynamic, and that's exactly what happened with my daughter. She was always wondering like who was right. As she got older, she kind of was able to have more discernment, but there was things that I had to do to be able to help her through it, to support her through it when the courts pretty much they failed in the way where um my dad's right to get visitation or custody superseded the rights of my daughter's like basic human rights. So that's what I realized as it was, kind of ending. And I think I realized that I wasn't gonna be helped. One of the worst quotes I remember from one of the judges was telling us when we were in front of him, and he just said, "This case has reached a point of no return." And I just remember thinking to myself, I okay, so that you can't fix this, then who can? Right? And then in the middle of that, my daughter's childhood still just moving forward day by day, and I know a lot of us who are caught up in these situations, we end up doing this bittersweet struggle of like counting down the days when your kid turns 18. But then it's bittersweet because then you realize that yes, the court order's over, but then at the same time, your child's childhood is over too. So when it was happening with my daughter, I went through immense levels of grief trying to figure out how to like navigate that because, you know, it was ending, but then at the same time, so was her childhood.
Well, and it's hard too because you want to foster a good relationship with your kids and have good, effective communication, but then you also don't want to add to the toxicity
Yeah.
of the relationship by bad mouthing the other parent. So that's a difficult situation to navigate through. Like you want them to be able to like, let's talk about what you're thinking or what you're feeling, but then like it's just tough.
So there was a lot of things that I did that I don't like in terms of how I handled the beginnings of it. Towards the end of it, I did have some more of a strategic thinking. I ended up checking out books. I was in therapy. I ended up taking anger management classes because there was a lot of things being said about me that not only were they not true, it was really hard to hear my daughter verbalize them. You know, so I worked with her at home primarily. I work with her at home, but that was hard. That was hard because that's not necessarily how I envisioned being a parent. You know what I mean? Like you're just countering what someone else is doing, and then you're wondering, am I doing more damage by countering them, like and then and then you have your own hangups too, where like, you have your own traumas from your own childhood that come into play in how you parent. And then now you add this toxic dynamic too of high conflict co-parenting, and it just feels like a hot mess that will it literally feels never ending until I think about 2018 is when I realized that this stuff was about to end. And I had to change things. And one of the main changing factors that really shifted things and moved the needle, I ended up doing something unorthodox that I wouldn't say I recommend it. I was just more ready for it because at that time I was building a different business to support me and my kids because there was hardly any child support coming in, from any of my exes. And I learned that I needed to move forward in a different way. And I canceled the child support payment from my daughter's dad because he was holding it over our heads. And I got tired of hearing him thinking that I was getting rich from the 230 something dollars he was sending. And I had already been working on building a business. So I just worked my buns off to build something. That way we didn't have to rely on that money. And, a lot of us out here, we're just doing things that will help us survive through these terrible terrible situations, so that's why I lead with unorthodox, and I wouldn't recommend it, because I'm not saying, listeners, go out there and cancel your child support payments, because a lot of women need these payments, you know what I mean, like, and it's also a child's right to be supported. But the question then lies, what happens if the other co-parent, so to speak, is now leveraging their is now weaponizing child support? What happens then?
Right. Well, and like you mentioned, this whole conflict parenting is all based on control and
Correct.
being able to maintain control. So then now if you take away
Right.
the piece that they're using
Mm-hmm.
as their control piece,
Correct.
then you just took away their power.
Correct. So once I did that, that's actually what moved a lot of the needle. And I'm not ready to talk about the rest of the components, but it definitely moved things. And my whole thing, that whole time I went through that court case, was to help my daughter have a life that she can choose from. And I can tell you the reason I'm telling and wording it this way was because when I was in it, I had joined several groups that pertain to my situation, and I was watching women on there posting about their 20-something-year-old child still being controlled by their father, who was narcissistic and high conflict when they were younger. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, that's not happening to my kid. So I set a bunch of things in motion that took a while. I planted seeds, and it took a while for them to be some type of, gain some benefit for my daughter. And they weren't perfect. I made a lot of mistakes along the way that I still, I acknowledge it, and I also validate my daughter in terms of the parts that maybe weren't the greatest of ideas that have affected her. But I felt like I had to do what I needed to do to be able to safeguard my daughter's start into her adulthood. That way she has independence, she has autonomy, and she can live a life that she sees fit, even if I don't agree with it.
Well, and I think, like you mentioned, there's a piece that isn't necessarily considered when you're in the throes of trying to raise your
Right,
child with a high conflict parent is what happens to the kid after
right,
they become an adult.
right.
That, does that control carry on
Correct.
from that high conflict parent into their adulthood and, affect their future relationships and their self-image and all sorts of things?
Right, right. Oh, 100%. So I saw that, and once I realized that typically someone that's high conflict, we'll just call them high conflict just for purposes of keeping it simple, they don't have foresight. They can't see into, like, and the reason I saw this was because I noticed that my ex couldn't see life after court order. He only saw within the framework and his perspective of what he was currently controlling, because he did have some control, but he couldn't see thereafter. Once you see that and you can kind of capitalize on what they can't see, you can actually change it for the betterment of your child, because our job, even if we're raising them, you're eventually raising an adult, not necessarily a child, right? So I capitalized on his lack of foresight to be able to release my daughter from his grip.
Okay, so Marisol, I think this is a good stopping point for right now because we've discussed like the features of co-parenting, and I think maybe we should do another episode that goes over how to navigate the co-parenting issues successfully
Okay.
for okay. All right. So we'll be back next week with your second episode.
Perfect.
I would like to thank Marisol again for joining me today and sharing her journey. And thank you for listening. Marisol created a profile for the 1 in 3 website in which she includes links to her website, socials, ebook, and her coaching availability. You can find the link to Marisol's 1 in 3 profile in the show notes. Make sure to tune in next week when Marisol returns and gives us tips and techniques on how to navigate high conflict co-parenting situations. Until then, stay strong. And wherever you are in your journey, always remember you are not alone. Find more information, register as a guest, or leave a review by going to the website 1in3podcast.com. That's the number 1, IN, the number 3, podcast.com. Follow 1 in 3 on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at 1 in 3 Podcast. To help me out, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. 1 in 3 is a .5 Pinoy production. Music written and performed by Tim Crow.